The event is Homelessness and Human Rights. This event serves as a capstone on an entire month of programming, specifically intended to foster critical dialogue and action around the issue of homelessness locally. This November was the inaugural year of CSU's Homelessness Awareness and Action Month. And we appreciate all of our partners for making this month a success. A special shout out goes to the CSU Housing and Dining Services, the Murphy Center for Hope, the Fort Collins Homeless Coalition, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, Neighbor to Neighbor, and to all of our panelists for tonight's event. And especially to Paul Boden, our keynote speaker. So Paul Boden is the organizing director of the Western Regional Advocacy Project. He became homeless at the age of 16 and began volunteering at a drop-in shelter in San Francisco eventually in 1983, eventually becoming a program director there. He then worked as a case manager in a supportive hotel program for mentally ill people. Paul served as executive director of San Francisco's Coalition on Homelessness for 16 years and was a founder of the Community Housing Partnership, a nationally recognized permanent housing corporation with optional supportive services. He served as president of its board for 10 years and was also a board member of the National Coalition for the Homeless and a co-chair of its civil rights and grassroots organizing work group. He has received dozens of community awards during the last 25 years and recognition from the City and County of San Francisco, the State of California, and the Congress of the United States. Paul regularly writes articles and op-eds and travels throughout the country doing talks just like our talk this evening. So we are very fortunate to have Paul join us, and I hope you will join me in welcoming Paul to the stage. Thank you, Paul.
While it's true that I did become homeless at a very early age, I was living on Long Island, New York. You may catch some little bit of an accent as I'm talking tonight. My story wasn't the typical story of homelessness. My mother died and my father was an asshole. And I got kicked out of the house, so did my sisters. And we went from the very typical middle-class, suburban, white American family to being out in the street. And what it taught me was the benefits of entitlement. I really fell into this situation with an expectation that I was taught my whole life up until the time I was 16 that, you know, my government works for me. And it does when you're coming up from that situation. That school is a right. That schools are decent. That people are entitled to protections and to the police to protect us from violence, not to be perpetrators of violence. That, you know, we have a standard of expectation that leaves us feeling as though we're entitled. That's not the story of America for millions and millions and millions of people. That's not their daily experiences. And so when I ended up and seeing my sisters suffer, and when I ended up out in the streets, I started looking around. And one of my first experiences, you know, these guys goofed on me because I went into a food stamp office, and on a Friday, I was supposed to pick up my stamps. The worker cursed at me and told me, "Don't worry about it, just come back Monday, they're not ready." And I was like, Monday's a holiday. And she hit a button, and all of a sudden, the next thing I knew, a security guard was throwing me out the door for talking back. And I was outraged. None of my friends thought it was funny. They were like, "Man, boy, where'd you grow up?" That's how it works. Get used to it. And I, to this day, I am now 57 years old. I've been doing this since I was 1983. The day I get used to it will be the day I quit doing this work. Nobody should be treated that way. Not just homeless people shouldn't be treated that way. Nobody should be treated that way by their government. Because regardless of our skin color, regardless of where we were born, regardless of our income status, or ever increasingly since 1983, regardless of our housing status, this is our government. And government is, and while we have to be honest and say it doesn't always pan out that way, government is supposed to be of the people and for the people, and we are the people, and we are entitled to dignity and respect. We've been putting that message out, doing years of the direct service work in an emergency shelter, 24-hour drop-in center program, which still becomes a model when we talk about day drop-in centers. They're very useful, they're very helpful. We've been doing them since 1983. They have not ended homelessness. Don't ever forget, it wasn't lack of shelters and drop-in centers that created homelessness. And so the opening of drop-in centers is a very decent, humane thing to do. It is not going to make homelessness disappear. If it had the ability to make homelessness disappear, homelessness would have disappeared 35 years ago, because that was our initial response. The first funders of homeless programs was FEMA. It was a crisis. It was an emergency, and it was supposed to be temporary. In 79, 80, 81, we had a downturn in the economy, they kept calling it, a recession, they kept calling it. And when the economy got better, this emerging problem of homelessness was going to go away, so we opened shelters and we opened drop-in centers. And we had support service staff. That was my job title. We were calling ourselves social workers, and we found out you need an MSW to actually call yourself that. So they changed our job title to support services specialist. When we look at what some of the more and more growing responses are to homelessness in America, we are looking more and more like the Grapes of Wrath. The only thing missing is Henry Fonda and somebody writing an awesome book and doing a movie about it. But we are more and more seeing local communities trying to rid itself of the presence of homeless people. And all of us, those organizations that you saw before, all of us feel like if we want to get real, because we do want to get real, and if we want to get real, we need to start addressing those issues. So we feel all of these need to be the context that we talk about. And this is what I mean. In 1937, what we today call HUD was created by the federal government. It was created to address the massive homelessness in America during the Great Depression. It was created specifically to remedy the unsafe and unsanitary housing conditions and the acute shortage of decent, safe, sanitary, blah, blah, blah housing. You can read it. That's what we call HUD was created to do. In 1998, this is 15 years after we opened our emergency shelter programs, there was a little thing going on called Contract with America. Welfare reform was the big key in it. Families that used to get aid for families with dependent children now were getting temporary assistance for needy families. And time limits on how long you could get the benefits. Food stamps were being wiped out. 300,000 people in one day lost their SSI, Social Security insurance disability payments because they had been silly enough to tell their workers during intake that they also had a co-occurring disability of alcohol or drug addiction. And so suddenly your mental illness or your physical disability wasn't enough for you to continue getting disability benefits because you also admitted, because you told the truth and admitted that you also had other issues going on in your life. This also happened at that time. And this was the federal government saying, we see the writing on the wall. We see Hope 6 coming down. We see the mortgaging off of public housing happening. We see that low-income housing tax credits are not affordable housing development structure for the poorest of the poor. So we need to relieve ourselves of any pretense that we as a government are responsible to ensure that these opportunities are happening for people in our community. It's deliberate, folks. It's thought out. It's planned. When you're writing federal legislation, you think about and you debate and you argue every single word. Anybody in here that's ever worked on local legislation or state legislation, every word in the legislative document is vetted by attorneys and is vetted by legislative experts because every word can come back in court and mess with you. So they are very deliberate. People don't make writing mistakes very often in legislative language unless they have a really silly and incompetent legislative analyst. They were going into the commodity mode. Housing was a commodity. So public housing was torn down, was sold off, was demolished as part of Hope 6. Section 8, which used to do project-based long-term housing subsidies, even with for-profit developers, were opted out, and they were eliminated. And we lost hundreds of thousands of units. Since the time this slide was created, there's at least another 150,000 units that we can document. You cannot lose that number of affordable housing units in a country where you didn't lift the income of the poorest of the poor at all. You cannot lose that many housing units and not think people are going to end up in the street. Where else are they going to go? Like it or not, we are not lemmings. We are not going to march off into the sea and drown ourselves. We are going to stay alive, we are going to fight, and we are going to end up living in streets, in communities across this country. And by we, people seem to think, and most of the intense actions actually happen in rural communities, most of the intense media spotlight, most of the intense media attention seems to happen in urban areas, and people seem to think that homelessness is an urban issue. This, one thing when that 1937 program got started, they actually had a common sense solution. Because of the Dust Bowl and the crisis that was happening in the farm areas of this country, we already had a United States Department of Agriculture. And so rather than create a separate housing department of the federal government in rural areas, they actually ran the housing, and they still do to the extent that they have it. They actually ran the housing programs through the United States Department of Agriculture. And you can see the same trends as housing became more and more of a commodity. The development of affordable housing for poor families and poor people in rural communities, many of these being family units, is now zero. You can't tell me that there is no longer a need for affordable housing for people living in rural communities. In this particular program, which was the biggest at one time, it was doing over 30,000 units of affordable housing a year. It's now zero. And then in the public housing sector, it's a nightmare. And Hope 6 was created because the conditions in public housing were so deplorable, because the maintenance funding for public housing had disappeared, the conditions became untenable. And so the solution of the federal government was, first and foremost, and this was Senator Dianne Feinstein from California, my senator, the person that represents my state, was to relieve the federal government of its responsibility that it inherited as part of the 1937 Housing Act, of its responsibility to replace units the federal government destroys one for one. So those 700,000 units you saw on the earlier slide, under previous federal legislation, the federal government had a mandate, a legal mandate, to replace at minimum the 261,000 public housing units they destroyed, a legal mandate to replace those units one for one. The first step they took was to relieve themselves of that legal requirement and change the law, because there was absolutely no intention of replacing those units at not even close to one for one. In fact, in public housing under Hope 6, it's 1/3 of the units that stayed affordable to the poorest people, the people that were at the income levels that were living there previously. 1/3 of those units. Other tenants were given a voucher and told to go out in the community, find a private landlord that will rent to you with this voucher from HUD, is willing to accept the HUD bureaucracy and HUD morass of getting funding from HUD on a regular basis. And then maybe that person will house you, and you can have the voucher, and it's only good for 1 year, and then you have to renew it. 60% originally of those vouchers were returned. When they extended the timeline a little bit, over 45% of the vouchers that poor families get are returned to the housing authority because they cannot find landlords willing to buy into the HUD bureaucracy. This is creating massive contemporary homelessness and prolonging homelessness for those who become homeless. And the reaction of local communities more and more is to blame the victim, is to blame the people that are ending up out in the street. I want to state unequivocally, and I've done this work for 35 years, I don't know any homeless people that were in Congress at the time the votes were taken to implement these decisions. Nor in 98, nor in 80 when Reagan cut all of the funding out. I don't know any homeless people that were in Congress or in the Senate or working for HUD that were part of the decision-making process that implemented these policies. So to say that homelessness is a choice of homeless people, to say that homelessness is because homeless people are service resistant or whatever the current phrase is for that, that's being used, resource resistant, say it however you want to say it. Because the language we use and the titles we give things seems to be the only thing that's changed over the last 35 years. But what hasn't changed is, come hell or high water, the fact that these people are living in my streets, as my community, in my town, in my doorway, is because these people choose to be there. The data would tell you otherwise. History would tell you otherwise. If the 10-year plans were 10-year plans, how to address this stuff, they might have had a chance to work. By the time when Clinton did the 5-year plans, we weren't so far along in this process. We hadn't done Hope 6 yet. We could have saved those public housing units if the planning processes and going into creating the 5-year plans under the Clinton administration had been, let's all sit down as a group and community after community. Let's use the League of Cities and let's sit down as a group where the advocates, the homeless people, the housing developers, the city officials, the police, if they want to be in the room. They didn't create homelessness. I don't know what they're going to do to end it. They don't know what they're going to do to end it, I wouldn't imagine. It wasn't lack of cops that created homelessness. Everybody knows that. Yet they seem to be the point people getting looked at in terms of addressing it. There's something structurally wrong with that. You're setting everybody up for failure with that approach. But had we used those meetings and that time and that research and the skills to actually start addressing what created the problem in the first place, we wouldn't be anywhere near as bad off as we are today. And this is what I'm talking about. You can't, and I've had several debates with federal officials over several administrations. Phil Magano and I probably met more than either one of us cared to. And they called me a jerk, and I called them much worse than that. But they never disputed this data. And you go to our website, you can read this report in English, you can read it in Spanish. The data is the same, it's documented. You can disagree with the analysis, but you can't tell me that these numbers are not accurate. This is what happened. And this is when you see 1983. That's when we started opening emergency shelter programs throughout the country. New York started in 81. San Francisco's homeless program started in October of 1982. It is right around this window that we started opening emergency shelter programs in the United States. By 1987 is when the federal government passed the McKinney bill, and it wasn't called McKinney until the guy died in a plane accident. It was called the Homeless Emergency something. But it wasn't until 87 that the Fed started funding that. Before that, it was all funded locally. And FEMA funded it as well. But the federal program administered by HUD that is the guiding force of the 10-year plans and the chronic homeless plans and the local homeless coordinating boards, that didn't happen until 87. And as you can clearly see, we've never replenished that money. And I don't care how much shelter money they put out, I don't care how much outreach we do, we can't replace that deep a pit of federal housing assistance with shelters, with outreach, with life skills training. You can give me all the life skills training in the world you want. It isn't going to get that money back, and people are going to stay homeless. This is a response to the mantra that the federal government loves to put out, that we can't afford it. Well, the United States government can blow up the 50 largest cities in the world without reloading, just with their Navy, just on our Navy ships, without reloading. We're pretty freaking safe. We have so much excess military equipment, we're giving it to police departments now, and while we continue to build more. Well, 2 less submarines, a couple of less fighter jets, a couple less combat ships. Canada ain't gonna invade us, folks. We're gonna be pretty freaking safe. And we would more than double, more than triple the amount of housing and homeless assistance we provide. It's not that we can't afford it, it's that we haven't figured out a way to make a profit off of it yet for corporate America. That's what drives the military. Eisenhower, who was no bleeding heart liberal radical hippie, General Eisenhower was the first one to put out serious discussion about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. This is one small example of it. We used to use the whole trillions of dollars in spending that happens over every couple of years. That's not real numbers. These are real numbers. And just a couple of less things, and you could go through 100 military programs and pull out a couple of less things, and homelessness would be a thing of the past, because we could easily restore the $54 billion a year that we lost in affordable housing funding at the federal level. And this is the other thing that really bugs us. A housing subsidy is a housing subsidy. If you owe me $50 and I tell you to keep it, I just gave you $50. If you ask me for $50 and I give you a $50 bill, I just gave you $50. It's the same end result for me. But somehow, when it comes to housing, if you're a homeowner and you get a housing subsidy through your mortgage interest deductions and through your local tax payment deductions, that's called economic stimulus. Last year, we did $144 billion in housing subsidies to homeowners. Having come from the street myself, and now I am a homeowner, when I was homeless, I didn't qualify for a housing subsidy. Now that I'm a homeowner, I qualify without anyone even asking me any questions. But it's a housing subsidy. It's a housing subsidy for homeowners. We do $34 billion a year in housing subsidies for poor people, and we say it's a drain on our economy. We say that we can't afford it. We say that they have to be moral enough to get it. They can't have a felony track record. They can't have family members sleeping on their couch. I tell you right now, the United States government has never gone into a homeowner's house and said, you can't let your cousin sleep on the couch. I'm kicking you out of your house because we're subsidizing your housing. But they are. The only difference is the income levels of the people that are receiving those subsidies and who's benefiting from that housing subsidy program. Because we all know this housing subsidy program for homeowners benefits the mortgage industry, the banks, the real estate industry, and the construction industry. And it's what's driving the gentrification that we see happening in communities across the country. Who benefits from the affordable housing programs? Poor people. Poor people and poor neighborhoods and poor communities benefit. So the poor people's programs are the programs we can't afford, and they're not moral, and we should go sweep the streets for the benevolence being shown to us to get a housing subsidy. I've never been asked to sweep the streets for my mortgage interest deductions. No one has asked me to do anything or check my arrest records, check my ethnicity, check where I was born, check anything. Nobody's counted my toothbrushes. Do you know they actually do that in public housing units now? If they feel like it, if they don't like you, they come in and count the toothbrushes in your bathroom to see if it matches the number of people that are on your lease. And that's the $34 billion program, not the $144 billion program. The fact that we have massive homelessness has as much to do with race and class issues, more to do with race and class issues in this country than any other factor in terms of contributing factors with massive homelessness and contemporary homelessness. And then we set up planning processes to discuss everything but the stuff that I'm talking about. Every 5-year plan, there's 855 separate 10-year plans written by separate communities to end homelessness, most of which are now 15 years old. And so now we have 2020 plans for families, 2017. Well, it was 2017 for vets. Now that's been extended because we're not talking about cause and effect when we talk about addressing these issues. We're talking about the behavior of people that are living out in the street, the presence of people that are living out on the street, and who doesn't like those people that are living out in the street because they got to be moved from those neighborhoods. So we have sit-lie laws. Can you believe we're passing laws that say it's illegal for people to sit on a public sidewalk? Is that the number one crime issue in America today? The fact that people are sitting down? Am I mugging anybody when I'm asleep? But yet sleeping is a crime? Well, you know what? Everybody here is sitting, but you're not in a public space. But you go out into a public space, you are gonna see people sitting down. Only some of those people will ever go to jail for it. Only some people will ever go to jail for the heinous crime of sleeping. The fact that they call what we do camping is BS. It's unadulterated BS. Camping is something you do by choice in the woods. Sleeping in a park, sleeping in the street, sleeping in a doorway is not camping. It's surviving. Because like it or not, everybody's gonna sleep at some point, which is why they say it's cruel and unusual punishment under the Geneva Convention to not let people sleep. This is another thing that's not in any of the 10-year plans, the 5-year plans, the chronic homeless plans. Nobody wants to talk about the racial issues. Look in our prisons, look in our jails, look in our shelters, look in our streets, and look at the overall percentage of people. African Americans are 3.5 times more likely than any other segment of the community to end up homeless. There's a reason those numbers jump out, and there's a reason they're ignored. And we need to start calling that question when we talk about what are we going to do about homelessness in our local communities. The fact that we talked to now almost 1,600 people, same question asked of all of them in English, in Spanish. These are the results that we got: sleeping, sitting, and standing still. They call it loitering, we call it standing still. Those by far are the top 3 criminal offenses people are being charged with when you talk to 1,600 homeless people in 5 different states in 12 different cities. And now we're adding Florida and we're adding other, and what we find is the numbers keep going up, but the percentages stay pretty much basically the same. Sleeping, sitting, laying down, and standing still. If I can't sit, if I can't stand still, if I can't lay down and I can't sleep and I'm houseless, I don't have a house, what can I do? I can walk. That's it. As soon as I stop walking, and we have some national stats, and I know Lynn is going to have some local things about these laws, but just like in the bad old days, Jim Crow's a thing of the past. No, it ain't. Anti-Okie laws would never happen again. Oh yeah, what is it they said to Henry Fonda as soon as he got into Barstow, California? You better keep walking, boy. Don't let the sun set on you here. Yeah, it ain't over. It ain't gone. Because if every other activity, and in California I'll speak to very deliberately, there's on average in 82 cities that were examined by the law school at UC Berkeley, 9 laws on the books to criminalize those 3 activities, as well as food sharing and eating. On average, 9 laws on the books. As soon as any homeless person in those 82 communities throughout the state of California, and it's only 82 because that's all we looked at, as soon as those people stopped walking, the cops had 9 separate laws that they could use to jack them up if they felt enough heat, enough pressure to push them to do it, or if they just decided they didn't like the dude's face and they felt like doing it. 9 laws as soon as you stop. Basurero treaties, people, look it up, especially with Trump coming in. Look this stuff up. This country, there's a set of laws that were called the ugly laws that's in the handout that you got, because I included the language from that law because at least they were honest. If you're diseased, maimed, and unsightly, we're going to criminalize your presence. At least be honest. If you're going to tell people, we don't want you here, get the hell out of our town, at least say it. Say it directly. Don't say you're doing it for my safety or to protect me or because you don't want me eaten by a bear or for whatever the hell reason you're coming up with for why you want to protect me. You know what they're saying to the people in Standing Rock right now? We're going to sweep you out because we want to protect you. We can call BS when we see it. And if you're going to treat human beings so blatantly that as soon as they stop walking, should you so decide, you can criminalize their presence, I think you owe them the courtesy and the respect to at least be honest about it. And so we feel that because this is happening in so many communities, you know, the worst communities, you know, got nothing on the other communities. Florida is off the freaking hook. But you know what? Eureka's got vigilante squads going out because this kind of dehumanizing, this kind of demonizing the presence of human beings inevitably leads to vigilanteism. Inevitably, it's going to lead to that. When, you know, the way that they promoted Jim Crow was they demonized African Americans. The way that they promoted the colonization of the United States was to demonize Native Americans. The way that they promoted the Basurero treaties was to demonize. The way that we're treating Muslim Americans today is we're demonizing. The way that we are treating homeless people is absolutely a demonization and a dehumanization of the fact that we are human beings first and foremost and always. And we deserve to be treated as human beings. And so we feel that that's got to be the crux. And we may come from homelessness. I was homeless for 6 years, and I've been working in the stuff at the front lines for 30 on top of that. But this isn't just a homeless issue. Homeless people weren't the first targets of this kind of racist and classist policing and public policy. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like are going to be the last targets of this. And so we call on no human being to be left out in the goddamn street. We can afford to do better than that. We call on nobody to be allowed to be discriminatorily enforced by the police departments against their presence. We call on no laws on the books. You know, they talk about time, place, manner restrictions, that the government, local governments have a constitutional right for time, place, and manner restrictions. That's led to a history of this kind of racist policing and this kind of racist public policy. We say, just like you would to your child if they were drunk and kept driving the car, give us the freaking car keys back. You have abused your right to be able to pass these laws. Nobody can be criminalized for sleeping, for sitting, for standing still, or for laying down in a non-obstructive manner. If they ain't bothering nobody, they ain't hassling nobody, then you are going to have to leave them the hell alone. And if you're going to arrest somebody, arrest a system that has created a situation that is so inhumane and that is so demonizing. And these aren't the only, this is our legislation. It's in Colorado. It's being introduced again. The League of Cities is going to oppose it again. We're pretty confident about that. and it's in Colorado, and it's in Oregon, and it's in California, because no worthwhile civil rights legislation has ever been passed on the first reading. And we are gonna keep bringing it back. That street outreach, our realities, who's in our jails, our treatment of mentally ill people, our treatment of people of color dictates to us that while we came from the street, this ain't just about us. We were human beings long before we were homeless, except those poor kids that was born into homelessness. And we ain't gonna end this just looking at us. But you wanna end homelessness? Nothing does it like a home. A home is the #1 solution to homelessness. Unfortunately, history tells us we will still have racism. We will still have classism. We got a long way to go to address those issues. But I can tell you from having been at both sides of the equation, you want to address homelessness, housing will do it every freaking time. I might still be poor. I might still be mentally ill. I might still be just like every other human being, all kinds of different things. But I ain't gonna be homeless anymore once my butt is in a house. And you know, there was a $4 million 3-year study, just as only HUD could do. $4 million, no, it was, it was $4 million for 3 years. I was gonna give them the benefit of the doubt and say it was the other way, but it wasn't. Because they love to study poverty. They love to study homelessness. You wouldn't believe it. If you took all the studies of homeless people that have been done and used the trees for the paper to build some freaking housing, we would probably have 1/3 less homeless people in the United States today. But they did a 3-year, $4 million study and found that families that had an opportunity to move into permanent housing, 3 years later, 98% of those families were still there. Could have told you that for $1, sucker. You know, like you come up off the street, you come up through the shelter system, you have an opportunity to bring you and your kids into a decent place to live. Yeah, you're gonna freaking stay there, dude. That's how it works. That's how it works. Our DNA did not change in 1982 where suddenly millions of people decided, man, this living indoors sucks. Oh, I'm gonna go sleep outside. That's so much, and you guys got it cold, man, Jesus. You know, in Denver right now, they're taking sleeping bags and warm weather gear from all the people that they're sweeping. Why? Because they obviously want them to get the hell out of Colorado. There's no other reason you would do that. No other reason you would do that. In the freezing cold to take the warm weather gear from people that are sleeping outside unless you wanted them to get the hell out of your town. So we feel that the hygiene centers, the other issues that are related here, the fact that you don't have any housing, but it's illegal to sleep in a legally parked vehicle doesn't make any sense to us. You know, there's clearly other issues that play here, and that is in some of our legislation. But you know, the thing about the right to legal counsel is when you get the ticket, you can't fight it with an attorney. Once you don't have the money to pay the ticket or show up in court in 14 days, then you get an attorney, but the case against you has nothing to do with why you got the ticket. The case against you is because you didn't pay the ticket. Well, you wouldn't have had the bench warrant issued if you'd been able to pay the ticket, so by the time you have access to an attorney, it's too late to do you any freaking good. That's double jeopardy. That's a setup for failure, and that's a setup to criminalize. And we feel that all of these things need to be taken into consideration. This is, again, this slide was made as of last year. There's now 184, I believe, or something like that. I don't know. But it's still a hell of a lot of organizations. And I think it's important to note here, and this is the second to last slide, they're not just homeless groups. They're day labor groups. They're civil rights groups, they're food justice groups. They're not just homeless groups. They're groups that recognize that we got a serious systemic issue that's putting millions of people out in our streets. You know, in 2006, when they started counting, there were 96,000 children in our public school system that were documented as being homeless. 96,000. Last year, there were 1.3 million. And in the middle of that time frame, the federal government's choice in order to do chronic homeless single adult 10-year plan priority programming was to redefine when a family counts as being homeless. So you now have point-in-time head counts being done under the federal government, HUD's definition of when somebody is homeless. So that, and I'm telling you, hundreds of homeless family emergency shelter programs and drop-in centers were closed under this redefinition. But a family that shows up in an emergency shelter program has to prove that they're actually homeless. If they're doubled up, if they're tripled up, no good. You got to get the hell out of here. You're not homeless. If they're living in a single room occupancy hotel, you don't count anymore. You're not homeless enough. They literally started using the term poorly housed to separate out, like food challenged as opposed to hungry. Poorly housed in order to separate out families in crisis so that they could redivert the money to chronic homeless single adult programs. There's a lot of family providers. There's a lot of youth providers. Youth fell under the same rubric. You know, homeless youth are not as visible. Families are not as visible. You lose your kids if you're out in the freaking street. You hide. You double up. You go somewhere. And to say that that means you're no longer eligible, like as if it's a freaking welfare program or some stuff, that you're no longer eligible for emergency shelter, being desperate enough to show up at an emergency shelter program doesn't mean you are eligible to get into an emergency shelter program because you're not as visible as the single adults. So we want to encourage everybody. We feel that there's more common ground in the stuff I'm talking about. I'm not attacking anybody in this room in the stuff I'm talking about. I'm challenging all of us in this room. We can build the alliances to actually, you know, if these guys could do it in 1937, if they had the ability to create what we are losing today, we have a responsibility to join forces and restore those cuts and revitalize that program and reverse those changes that were made to say housing for homeowners is okay, we'll continue to call that a value. It ain't more of a value than housing for poor people, because if housing's cool, and housing does freaking rock, and if housing's cool, it's cool for everybody, and we need to be fair about that. We need to be honest about that, and we need to make sure that it's available to everybody, because really, seriously, housing is freaking cool. Thank you all very much for your time.